Hello, I'm Andrew Budd. I'm the founder and CEO of iProov. And today I'm going to talk to you about how biometric authentication can be accomplished when the user is not in possession of hardware that has been certified, a new challenge for FIDO. Our challenge collectively is to establish trust in a remote user at the time of onboarding or subsequently at authentication. And what we're doing is we're establishing trust in the human being who is the remote user, as opposed to establishing trust in a set of attributes or something that the user possesses. These may be methods that we use to create that trust, but in the end, it's the human being that matters. It's the human being in whom that trust must be vested. Let's just remind ourselves why that matters. That linking of remote human beings to their identity attributes, embodied often in their documents, is absolutely fundamental to creating digital identities and to protecting people against identity theft. And the drivers for doing this are getting more and more intense. On the one hand, we're seeing a dramatic rise in fraud, in identity theft, and in financial fraud, based upon the use of synthetic identity and impersonated accounts. We saw a huge amount of money lost in 2019. In Japan, for example, there's been a 5 times increase in the amount of online identity-based fraud in the last year or two. On the second side, there is tremendous regulatory pressure beginning to occur. Regulators are clamping down on money laundering. They're demanding greater KYC diligence at the time of creation. So banks are simultaneously having to do a better job, and they're also having to do it in a more remote environment. So we're seeing an increase in the shift from in-person physical verification to onboarding in through digital channels. So these 3 pressures, the increasing pressure from fraud, the increasing pressure from regulators, and the relentless transition to onboarding to digital channels, is driving the need for better biometric identity verification at the time of onboarding. And we have to be clear that what we're doing is to assure that during these processes, we need to assure the person as well as the validity of their identity document. In FIDO models, often we build trust out from a trusted device, and by authenticating the user against the device, the trust of the device is then transferred. When you're onboarding, you can't base it on the trust of the device. You have to base it upon trust in the identity document itself. And therefore, the challenge is firstly to link the person, the human being, to the attributes that are supplied to the relying party from their assured identity document. The relying party, during an onboarding, during a KYC onboarding, has to be provided with the relevant biometric information. That is normally a regulatory requirement. Similarly, the relying party themselves has to take responsibility for the biometric match between the photo from the ID document and the biometric information from the person. They cannot delegate it to an unseen piece of technology. And normally speaking, during onboarding, there is absolutely no prior knowledge of the device whatsoever. And in these respects, this is very different, obviously, from the core use case for FIDO authenticators. If we look at how that flow actually works in practice, it usually is based upon government ID documents. The first thing is that the photo ID document, the information has to be extracted. This can be done either and the attributes have to be extracted. This can either be done photographically by imaging the document, or increasingly today, people are using contactless reading using the NFC readers in both Android and now iOS phones to get that information out in an error-free and fully certified manner. And that is then uploaded, obviously, to the relying party. But all you've got then are a set of trusted attributes. You've got no basis for trust the person presenting those attributes. So it's fundamental then to capture a selfie of the person, to capture an image of the person presenting it, and and to ensure that they match the person in the person the photo, which is part of the attributes. So closing the IDV loop requires a biometric match, matching to an image which ultimately comes from passport and is lodged with the relying party. Now, a second use case for authenticating without trusted hardware is replacement of a device. We all know devices devices have to be changed for a whole variety of reasons. And that moment of rebinding, when the user's device is retrusted, is a known weak point in the security system. At the time which I was founding iProov, in late 2012, there was a very fundamental article, some of you may remember, written by Matt Honan for Wired magazine, in which he described how that zero device, phone-based, knowledge-based re-enrollment was an attack point in which his entire digital life was destroyed. It made a great impression on me. So it's a known weak point in a security system. In-person re-enrollment has traditionally been the way demanded, and it's terrible. It's particularly in a post-COVID world and in a digital channel world, that is not increased. That's just not something which one can impose upon users anymore. Today, as I mentioned, often it relies upon, there's a fallback to re-enrolling with authentication based solely upon knowledge-based authentication. The name of my grandmother. That, I think we all know, that just is inadequate. It's not sufficient. It has numerous weaknesses. The solution to this, I think everybody understands, is when there is no device to rely on, then device independent and therefore cloud-based biometrics can deliver a simple and secure solution. The third requirement is when a use case has some sort of requirement for universal access requirements, when the relying party needs to address an entire population. And there are a number of aspects. One, this concept of inclusivity becomes commercially and politically extremely important. It becomes a core requirement that users must be able to authenticate via their personal devices without filtering them or segregating them or excluding them because they haven't got the right hardware. So inclusivity says that all sorts of personal hardware must be a feasible choice for authentication. Secondly, these requirements usually also have significant demands on accessibility, because they are addressing users with a very wide range of abilities, and therefore the verification process must be highly accessible to people of all ages, all ethnic backgrounds, and all cognitive abilities. And finally, security and resilience become extremely important. Many of these universal access requirements represent potential attack points at national security level. They are almost critical national infrastructure. And therefore, the verification solutions must not just be authentication theatre. They must be genuinely strong against the real threats, and we'll talk about them for a second. And every aspect of that process has to be backed up by robust certifications, both of the core technology and of the underlying business processes that maintain that strength, and without which the system could become vulnerable and threaten, in some cases, national security. Let's talk about some of those threats. Well, and there are a number of threats to biometric verification, the most obvious of which is obviously impersonation, that somebody who isn't depicted on their identity document or in their basic biometric trusted reference tries to authenticate themselves bogusly. The picture is one person. If the picture shows one person, the presenter is another. The second is what we call artifact attacks, where an object, be that an image on a screen, as you see on the right, or an elaborate and costly mask, like that one shown on the left, which represents me and my wife won't allow in the house, is presented to the camera of the authenticating device. There is a wide range of these technologies, and this is clearly a major attack vector, which I think the threat from which we all understand. What may not be, but then there is a new threat which is emerging, that of digital attacks. Here, what you're seeing is the power of the deepfake. You have a victim on the left, you have a perpetrator in the middle, And that way, and on the right, you can see that the perpetrator has assumed the victim's identity. And that this is a still, but it could easily be a moving, speaking image of the victim, doing whatever the perpetrator chooses to do, in a way that, with modern technology, becomes indistinguishable to the human naked eye. And this imagery can then be digitally injected. We'll talk about digital injection a little bit more in a second. So if we think about threats to biometric verification and how we mitigate them, clearly, we've talked about impersonation attacks. The mitigation for that is face matching technology. And modern face matching technology is now so good that I don't think any of us doubt its capability to amply deliver on the performance required to assure that the person authenticating looks like the right person. And then there's the second type of attack, the presentation or artifact attack. Here, what we're looking for is to determine whether this is a real person. It certainly looks like the right person by definition. It's going to look exactly, the face match will pass beautifully, but is it actually an artifact? Is it in fact a photo, a mask, or a video presented on a tablet? And the way we mitigate that attack is through the use of liveness. Liveness assurance, liveness technology is the term that, generally speaking, is accepted for mitigating the threat of presentation and artifact attack. But then we have the third attack, the replay or injected imagery attack, where imagery that may be as simple as a recording of a person in authenticating at a previous time and maliciously captured and stolen. It might be imagery that has been synthesized in all sorts of ways, including especially deepfakes. This is imagery that is indistinguishable to the naked eye from the real person, and it never goes through a camera. It never goes anywhere near the camera. It's digitally injected into the data stream, which is transmitted, which is sent either to the authenticator or to the relying party. And therefore it's missing all of the cues that normally a liveness assurance system would incorporate in its capabilities to look for. The real threat from replay and injected imagery attacks is that they can be done on a very, very large scale. They're extremely replicable, they're extremely transferable, and therefore they can be used to make very large amounts of money to attack on a nation scale level, and therefore it's worth investing very large amounts of money in accomplishing them. So therefore, the third mitigation has to be to a method of assuring that the human being, the live human being, is there in real time and is there right now. And we suggest that only if all three of these mitigations are in place can one generally be assured of the genuine presence of the user. Now, one of the challenges is testing standards. One of the core contributions of FIDO has been to provide certification and testing standards to the industry. Let's look at how they are, at what the status is for different types of attacks. We look at impersonation defenses, which is basically face matching. The attack vectors are extremely well understood. It's the wrong person. The performance standards are very well established. Things like NIST 863 have set down performance levels for good verification. There aren't that many test standards, but there are, shall we say, de facto test standards in the form of the NIST face verification standard. So impersonation defense is a very well characterized area for testing. If we look at artifact defenses, in terms of the attack vectors, the one thing we can say is that attack vectors for artifact attacks are pretty stable. You know, they rely upon photo technology, they rely upon the quality of retina screens, they rely upon the technology of 3D printing, and basically those things are now so good that we can say we understand just how good attacks can be, and those are unlikely to change in the future. Test standards exist. ISO 30107 describes how you set about testing these systems, but oddly enough, there are very few, in fact, almost no performance standards saying this is what you should test and this is how you should perform. In fact, I think the only international standard in the world today for the performance of defense against presentation attacks, for artifact defense, is set up by FIDO. and there's work going on to review that, because the first generation, I think, were generally regarded as not being established, as not being sound enough. Private laboratories have put together their own test standards and their own performance standards, but I think that there is still a gap in establishing strong methods of defining performance and the evaluation of that performance for artifacts. When it comes to digital attack defense, the situation is much more complex. The attack vectors are developing incredibly fast. The technology for developing deepfakes is very far, is evolving very, very quickly. So it's anything but a stable environment within which to characterize attack vectors. There are no test standards at all for evaluating digital attacks, and there are no performance standards. In the many environments in which we have had to show, as iProov, the quality of our digital attack defenses, the relying parties have built their own attack architecture, have built their own attack protocols, and have spent months, and I say that quite without exaggeration, months testing in an evolutionary way to explore our attack surfaces. In addition, there's also here a very complex interaction going on between the threat from digital attacks and the ability to mount them at scale, and the way that the device has been engineered, and the integrity with which any software apps have been built. We're seeing, obviously, in the FIDO environment, both hardware FIDO authenticators and software FIDO authenticators, and clearly any software FIDO authenticator can be subverted in order to mount digital attacks. So there's a complex interaction going on between the attack vector and the level of trust that can be placed in the device and app, and that has to be taken into, I think we'll have to take that into account. Let me now move on to talk about some case studies for how cloud-based authentication has been used at scale in real life environments. The first example involves an eIDAS solution. Some of you may be familiar with eIDAS. It's the European regulation governing federated digital identity for public acceptance purposes right throughout the European Union. SK Identity Solutions is the issuer who issues so-called qualified signatures it qualifies eIDAS, a variety of certificates in Estonia, which will be recognized throughout the European Union. And SK issues qualified signatures, which is the very highest level of trusted credential that can be issued under eIDAS. eIDAS issuers such as SK have to meet very stringent requirements on their business system. So one of the things they require, for example, is long-term access to the forensic evidence used at the time of the creation of that signature, and that includes the biometric data. So the biometric data has to be stored and kept available to the issuer for many years. It's not acceptable for it to be deleted or held or inaccessible. Secondly, the eIDAS certification requires rigorous, and I mean rigorous, independent audit by a professional third party, not just of the technology used, but of the entire business system. And that includes the code development. It includes all the breach processes, all the breach processes and reaction processes, notification process. It treats the authentication process not just as a piece of technology, but as a business system. And it's important because to do qualified signatures under Article 24 requires a level of trust equivalent to an in-person verification. And therefore, this is the first time that remote biometric authentication has actually been certified to replace in-person verification in this very stringent environment. Second case study involves the government of Singapore, the Ministry of Technology, GovTech. The government of Singapore issues has a national digital identity platform known as SingPass, which is a single sign-on solution available to all 4 million Singapore citizens, which gives them secured access to hundreds of public and now increasingly private digital services. And the government of Singapore selected iProov to secure this next generation of digital identity services, and that is now deployed and live. They selected an authentication method which was inclusive, and that meant device independent, strong at a national security level, and yet totally passive because of the inclusion requirements that we talked earlier. Biometric credentials are stored in the cloud for security against loss of devices or compromise of devices, and above all to enable universal access, because people can log on using their SingPass credentials in a variety of different places, including kiosk-based government offices. And again, it was an important part of GovTech's requirement specification that the biometrics should be stored centrally and not on the device for the reasons that we discussed previously. Third example is the US Department of Homeland Security, with whom we've been working at iProov now for about 2.5 years. The remit is to enable travelers, particularly trusted travelers, to quickly transit border ports of entry, but particularly remote border ports of entry. The objective, which has been accomplished, is to enable trusted travelers to report their entry and or exit to the Customs and Border Protection Force using a secure and obviously very privacy-focused mobile app. So people can check themselves in and out of the United States through their mobile phone instead of having a CBP officer attend in person. An absolute requirement of this use case is that authentication must take place off device. The biometric checking takes place against the TVS Trusted Traveler Database and only against that. So in this particular case, it's essential that the authentication does not rely upon does not place any reliance upon the integrity of the device hardware, and it doesn't rely upon biometrics that are stored anywhere near the device. The security requirements for this application are, as you might imagine, extremely stringent. And prior to deployment, it was a requirement that iProov should undergo a federal red team biometric penetration test process. This took place in the spring of 2020. Perhaps it was even the first of its kind ever. In any case, it lasted several months and involved the federal intelligence contractor mounting attacks of an intensity and a sophistication that I don't think we or anybody else have ever seen before. It explored extensively vulnerability to a variety of different deepfake attacks, and at the end, the results were extremely positive, and we've been cleared for deployment in the next phase of the program. So we've talked a bit about iProov. It's worth talking just a little bit about the about the performance of the technology in the field, given that our cloud-based biometric authentication for onboarding and repeat authentication has been used by millions of people over the last year. We have one of the advantages of doing it in the cloud is that you can measure the success rates. One can actually analyze and generate data from the user experience, and we've been able to ascertain that indeed our simple, passive, accessible user experience has delivered success rates that are between 95 and 99% in the field, as when used by the full range of people in many countries in Europe, in the Far East, and in Southern Africa. The security is based upon our concept of a one-time biometric information which is quite useless for an attacker to steal because it's obsolete as soon as it's been used, coupled with our active threat management, which leverages the cloud aspect of the genuine presence assurance processing to monitor and analyze continually attacks taking place throughout all of our systems throughout the whole world, to be able to survey the attackers to look at the methods they're adopting, the experimental protocols they're following, and then to be able to adapt our systems to provide ongoing resilience to that kind of attack. And finally, we have a system of privacy based on something we call the privacy firewall, which completely protects personal attributes. And none of iProov's biometric authentication ever is informed by any PII whatsoever. At no stage does iProov have any information, PII, about the person other than an anonymous pseudonym, which is a reference to that person and different between each service provider. So within the European GDPR, we are processing special category personal data, but that is the only data about the person that we ever receive, and any other personal attributes of the person are protected by this privacy firewall, which is a huge contribution both to privacy and also security, because it makes the information that is stored and processed in the cloud utterly worthless and pointless to try to compromise. So, and these are the characteristics of our system, whose objective is to assure the presence of the right person, to assure that it's the real person, and to assure that they're verifying right now. I would invite you warmly to come and visit our, alas, virtual booth, and to find out more about our assurance technologies, including genuine presence assurance. Thank you very much indeed for your attention, wherever in the world you are, and we'll look forward to talking to you more about assuring people. Thank you very much.